Hey everybody, my thoughts on Anthem. For those of you who've been living under a rock, this is a game from BioWare that was released in 2019 to a very mixed reception overall, and it came out later on that the conditions during its development were absolutely terrible. There are plenty of articles and videos about its troubled development, so I won't really go into very many details here, but suffice to say, the developer behind this, BioWare, is basically a hollow husk of what it once was. As far as I'm aware, pretty much all of the old guard, the people who were around during the heyday of BioWare, where they were putting out games like Neverwinter Nights and Knights of the Old Republic, Jade Empire, the original Mass Effect and Mass Effect 2, and of course Dragon Age, are all gone. They've all left the company and moved on to other things. Some of them aren't even in game development anymore. And for a lot of them, it seems like they had been dealing with all manner of crap for a while, and Anthem was more or less the last straw. Honestly, given all the stuff that came out about what the development conditions were, I really can't blame them. Now, of course, after the very wimpy release of Anthem and the large amount of criticism they got, they did say that eventually they were going to do sort of an overhaul to the game to address a lot of the concerns people had. They ended up canceling those plans in February of this year in favor of working on the next Mass Effect and the next Dragon Age game. Obviously, Anthem was deemed a lost cause, and I can't blame them considering how few people were actually playing it, and they just decided to move on to the next project that they actually have some vague chance of pulling off. Although given what happened with Anthem, and the fact that BioWare is such a hollow husk of what it once was, with basically none of the staff that made it great back in the day still working there, it's basically impossible to be enthusiastic about the next Mass Effect or Dragon Age game. About the best we can really hope for is that they're not terrible. So where does that leave us with Anthem? Well, honestly, there's really not much to say about the game itself. I mean, it's a functional looter shooter, and that means that you're going to be running around and shooting things with very generic weapons that mostly all look almost exactly the same. They all function almost exactly the same. The only difference is that the stat numbers are a bit different. You have a selection of exosuits that more or less constitute the game's classes as far as being a looter shooter goes, so they give you some very basic abilities, which you can slot some slight modifications into to make them a bit different than the default, but you're still dealing with basically the same setup that Destiny has, where you have two basic abilities and then a so-called ultimate ability, where the only real purpose for all of these is just to do a whole bunch of damage all at once. And since your basic abilities have cooldowns, most of the time you're just going to be shooting stuff anyway, with some certainly competent but really not all that impressive gunplay that is just kinda tedious. None of the weapons are particularly satisfying to use because they all just occupy some pretty basic archetypes like assault rifle or sniper rifle DMR kinda thing or something along those lines. And since you're really only dealing with weapon archetypes rather than anything truly unique, you're just going to opt for something that does reliable damage, and that means you're probably just going to run around with an assault rifle the entire game. The combat loop quickly becomes quite repetitive, which means that you end up trying to focus on other elements of the game, only to find that there's really not a whole lot going on there. Sure, the world it's set in could be quite interesting, but you really don't interact with it in any meaningful way. It's just a bunch of set dressing for you to run around and shoot stuff in. The game does technically have a storyline, but it's so bland that it's pretty much impossible to care about anything that's going on. And even funnier is that they try to do the exact same kind of story that Destiny does, where it acts like you are the one really special person in this world, but it's a multiplayer game, so there are hundreds, if not thousands, of other chosen ones just like you running around. And unlike in previous BioWare games where your choices are actually at least somewhat meaningful, here they mean basically nothing. After all, this is just a third-person looter shooter in a similar vein to Destiny. That's not necessarily a problem if that's what you go in expecting, but BioWare were acting like this is going to be a role-playing game on top of being a looter shooter, and it really isn't one. It certainly doesn't help that your field of view when you're walking around in first person is really narrow, so it makes it quite nauseating whenever you're out of the suit, and all you can really do when you're out of the suit is talk to people and then go into menus in order to interact with things that actually do matter for your gameplay, like the way you've got your suit configured, or buying and selling gear, and that sort of thing. And once you are actually in the suit, you realize almost immediately that the gameplay consists of going from point A to point B, blasting anything that gets in your way, and maybe completing an objective by interacting with a single object, or taking an object and then interacting with another object. And while that's probably fine if you like looter shooters, it's still a problem of becoming extremely repetitive extremely quickly. And while I've been able to power through at least some looter shooters, like Tom Clancy's Division 1 and 2 and Destiny 1 and 2, those games at least make it abundantly clear that they are just looter shooters and nothing more. Anthem, on the other hand, acts like it's both a looter shooter and a role-playing game, and it's not a role-playing game, and as a looter shooter, it is just painfully mediocre. Sure, the game's got an interesting setting, the art direction is pretty fantastic for the most part, and the idea of flying around in an exosuit is kinda cool for the first few minutes that you mess around with it. But it doesn't run especially well. I mean, you've been seeing the frame rate counter up in the top left of this video the entire time, and you can see that it's really not all that great. And keep in mind, I'm running an i7 4790K, 16 gigs of RAM, and a GTX 1080, all of which are more than capable of handling a game like this. It's just that the game's not all that well optimized. In addition to not running especially well, the netcode's not particularly good. There's some noticeable lag even playing it solo, which is really annoying. And the gameplay loop becomes so repetitive so quickly that after the first couple of hours of gameplay, you're just pretty much done with it. And with neither compelling gameplay, nor a compelling story and characters, nor any compelling role-playing to be had, it just ends up being a game that's not remotely worth playing, especially not compared to its competitors. And that's a real shame, because they could have done something really interesting with this setting, and they could have done something really interesting with the exosuit gameplay, but the game went through development hell, and when it finally managed to get out of that, they had taken a pretty interesting setting and gameplay concept and just turned it into a bland, repetitive, and ultimately boring looter shooter that is not remotely worth playing compared to other games that were coming out around that time, like The Division 2, or games that had been out for a couple of years at that point, like Destiny 2. And since then, BioWare has been more or less dormant. They've been quietly trying to work on Dragon Age 4 and whatever the next Mass Effect game is going to be, but after Anthem, basically none of us have any confidence that they're actually going to be able to pull those off. It's just downright depressing to see a development studio like BioWare, one of the most acclaimed studios in gaming history, go down like this. I mean, they were on a noticeably downward trend with Dragon Age 2 and Mass Effect 3, but then they brought things back up a bit with Dragon Age Inquisition, and then after that, it seems like they just went into freefall without a parachute. So who knows what's going to happen in the future for BioWare. I certainly hope they're able to pull things around for the next Dragon Age and Mass Effect, but I can't really be enthusiastic about either of those things. And who knows, maybe a few years down the line they'll repurpose the universe for Anthem and the flying mechanics and such, and turn it into an actual role-playing game, or something that's at least a hell of a lot more interesting than a really crappy generic looter shooter that just happens to have exosuit flying in it. Though honestly, when they abandoned their plans to revamp Anthem, I'm pretty sure that entire franchise died along with those plans. At least, I'll certainly be very surprised if they ever try to bring it back. Let's put it that way. At any rate, those are my thoughts on Anthem and the situation surrounding the development and the subsequent release and abandonment of Anthem. I was hoping to be able to do a review of it, but I just really could not muster the fortitude to push myself all the way through the entire game, because it's just so dull to play. I've said it before, and I will certainly say it again, that I can work with a game being bad, but I really can't do anything with a game being boring, and that's exactly what Anthem is. Thanks for watching.